The insult, slick with rage and entitlement, echoed off the onyx-paneled walls of the hotel lobby. Ava Thorne stood frozen, the focal point of a dozen scornful, curious glances. Her client, a tech mogul whose deal had just imploded, had chosen her as the vessel for his fury. He accused her of incompetence, of mistranslation, his voice a venomous whip cracking the polished silence of the grand space. Her world, once defined by the careful nuance of language, shrank to the brutal simplicity of his words. When he lunged forward, his fingers digging into the delicate bones of her wrist to demand compensation, the gilded cage of the lobby became a place of profound and public shame. But a silence was about to fall over this gilded lobby, a silence more absolute than any shout, and it would change her life forever. If you stay with us until the very end, you will discover how a single glance can rewrite a soul. Subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. At 29, Ava was an interpreter, a ghost who lived in the space between words, translating not just language, but the unspoken intentions that powered this city. She was a phantom in expensive suits, her presence required, but her existence ignored. Her life was a quiet, solitary affair, a small apartment that felt more like a refuge than a home, and a moral compass that had become both her shield and her burden. In a world of compromise and shifting loyalties, she clung to a rigid sense of right and wrong, an anchor in the turbulent waters of other people's ambitions. The atmosphere of the Manhattan Grand was its own form of oppression. The low, constant hum of the climate control, the distant, polite chime of an elevator, the scent of leather, expensive perfume, and old money. It all served to remind her of her place. She moved through these corridors of power on silent feet, her gaze often fixed downward, not out of subservience, but to avoid the cold, dismissive eyes of those who saw her as little more than a function. The opulence was a language she translated but could never speak for herself, a constant, glittering reminder of the chasm between her world and theirs. She did not cry or plead. The humiliation burned behind her eyes, a hot, private shame, but her expression remained a mask of stoic neutrality. This resilience was not born of apathy, but of profound loss. Years ago, she had watched her father's small, honest business be crushed by a man just like this. A man for whom integrity was a weakness to be exploited. She had promised herself then that she would never let them break her spirit as they had broken his. Her dignity was the last, unbreakable piece of him she had left to honor, a silent monument to a forgotten sense of justice. This was not the first time she had been treated as invisible, as a tool to be discarded once its purpose was served. The condescending tones, the dismissive hand gestures, the expectation that she absorb the frustrations of powerful men. It was an unspoken part of her job description. She had learned to navigate these currents with a quiet grace, to swallow the small injustices and carry on. But this was different. The physical contact, the raw, public aggression, had crossed a line, shattering the fragile peace she had so carefully constructed around herself. She was no longer a service, but a target. Even before the mogul had raised his voice, a subtle shift had occurred in the lobby's atmosphere. The ambient noise seemed to drop by a decibel, the light from the chandeliers dimming ever so slightly. She had felt it more than seen it, a sudden, focused stillness that had settled in a far corner of the room, near the shadows of a marble column. A presence contained and powerful had entered the space, its attention a palpable weight in the air. It was the predatory calm before a storm she did not yet know was gathering solely for her. Her days began before the city, in the pre-dawn. Grey that filtered through the single window of her small walk-up apartment. The world outside was a muted symphony of distant sirens and the rumble of the first subway train, sounds that served as the metronome for her solitary routine. Each movement was precise, economical. The folding of the worn quilt, the careful measuring of coffee grounds, the selection of another beige suit that served as both professional uniform and emotional armor. This quiet control was her only defense against the chaos she would soon step into, a ritual of self-preservation in a life that felt increasingly owned by others. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror was that of a stranger, a tired woman with eyes that held too many secrets. The journey to work was a daily lesson in insignificance. Pressed into the humid, crowded confines of a city bus, she was just another anonymous face in a sea of weary commuters. She would stare out at the blur of Manhattan's steel and glass towers, monuments to a power and wealth she only ever witnessed from the periphery. These structures were the temples where she served, translating the ambitions of powerful men, yet she was forever relegated to the outside, looking in. The stark contrast between the world she facilitated and the one she inhabited was a silent, heavy weight, a constant reminder of the unbridgeable gulf that defined her existence. Her employer, a prestigious but ruthless translation agency, treated its interpreters as high-functioning commodities. Her boss, a man named Davies with a perpetually strained smile, spoke of clients with the reverence a priest reserves for saints, while speaking to his staff with thinly veiled impatience. The pressure was immense and unspoken. A single mistranslated word could derail a multi-million-dollar merger, and the blame would fall squarely on the invisible woman in the corner. Ava's perfection was not a goal, but a requirement for survival, a tightrope she walked every day over a canyon of professional ruin and financial destitution. The most significant pressure, however, came not from boardrooms, but from a quiet, suburban house hundreds of miles away. A weekly phone call to her ailing mother was a delicate dance of reassurance and evasion. She would listen to her mother's fading voice, filled with worries about medical bills and the leaking roof, and would promise that everything was fine, that work was good. Every dollar she earned was already spent, a portion sent home to keep that fragile world from collapsing. This responsibility was her anchor and her cage, tethering her to a job that slowly chipped away at her soul, forcing her to sacrifice her own future for their past. She carried the ghost of her father with her into every meeting. He had been a man of principle, a small business owner who believed in a handshake and an honest day's work. She had watched as a larger, more ruthless corporation swallowed his company whole, crushing him not with superior products, but with legal loopholes and brutal financial force. He never recovered from the injustice, and in his quiet defeat, Ava found her unshakable moral code. She would not bend, she would not break, and she would not become like the men who had destroyed him. Her quiet dignity was a silent act of rebellion, a tribute to the man he was. This dual existence was a constant source of emotional whiplash. In the morning, she might be translating a tense negotiation over the acquisition of a European art collection in a penthouse overlooking Central Park, the air smelling of leather and old money. By evening, she would be standing under the flickering fluorescent lights of a grocery store, carefully calculating whether she could afford fresh vegetables or if it would be another week of pasta. She moved between these two realities like a ghost, fluent in the language of luxury and power, but possessing neither, a transient in the lives of the elite. In the quietest moments of her solitude, she allowed herself to dream. Tucked away in a drawer was a small leather-bound journal, filled not with words, but with intricate pencil sketches of buildings. She had wanted to be an architect, to create spaces of beauty and permanence, to build things that lasted. It was a fragile, secret ambition she nurtured in the dark, a whisper of the woman she might have been in another life. This dream was the last untouched part of her, a sanctuary of hope in a world that demanded her practicality and relentlessly punished her idealism. The assignment at the Manhattan Grand came through on a Tuesday morning, delivered by Davies with an unusual urgency. The client was a tech mogul, a volatile but obscenely wealthy man whose satisfaction was paramount. "He's difficult, Ava, but the commission is a game-changer," Davies had said, his voice a mix of warning and encouragement. She felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. These difficult men were always the same. They viewed service providers not as professionals but as subjects. Still, she needed the money. She accepted, stepping knowingly into the lion's den. From the moment the negotiation began in a sterile, windowless conference room, the air was charged with the client's abrasive ego. He saw her not as a linguistic expert, but as an extension of the room's furniture, often speaking over her or directing comments about her to others as if she weren't there. Ava maintained her professional composure, her voice a calm, steady instrument, translating his barely concealed threats and the other party's polite deflections with flawless precision. But she could feel his frustration mounting as the deal began to unravel, and she knew from experience where that rage would eventually be directed. When the deal finally collapsed, he did not wait for the privacy of the elevator. In the vast, echoing expanse of the hotel lobby, he turned on her, His voice, loud and laced with venom, cut through the polite hum of the opulent space, accusing her of misrepresenting his words, of sabotaging his deal. Heads turned. The quiet judgment of strangers felt like a physical blow. The humiliation was a hot, suffocating wave, but she stood her ground, her face a mask of neutrality. It was then that he lunged, his fingers wrapping around her wrist like a manacle, his face contorted in a snarl of entitlement and fury. It was then, in that moment of absolute public degradation, that the air in the lobby shifted. It did not break. It was replaced. The cacophony of the mogul's rage and the murmurs of the onlookers were swallowed by a sudden, profound silence that emanated from a corner of the room previously lost to shadow. A man had risen from a leather armchair, a figure carved from the lobby's most profound darkness. He was not large in a brutish way, but his presence was immense, a gravitational force that bent the light and sound around him. Every eye in the room, including the moguls, was drawn to him, captured by an authority that required no announcement. The world, which had shrunk to the point of Ava's wrist, now expanded to encompass this one still figure. He was Declan Lynch, a name spoken only in hushed, fearful tones in the city's hidden corridors of power, a phantom of the underworld who moved through the overworld with unnerving ease. Dressed in an impeccably tailored dark suit that seemed to absorb the ambient light, he was the personification of controlled power. His face was a study in severe, handsome lines, but it was his eyes that held the room captive, the color of a winter sea, intelligent and utterly devoid of sentiment. A thin, silvery scar bisected his left eyebrow, the only flaw on an otherwise perfect mask, a silent testament to a life forged in violence. He carried his past not as a burden, but as a component of his unshakable stillness. He said nothing. He did not need to. His gaze settled on the mogul, and it was not a look of anger, but of cold, clinical assessment, as if observing an insect. Then he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to two men standing discreetly near the entrance. It was not a command, but a conclusion. Instantly, the two figures detached themselves from the architecture, moving with a fluid, silent efficiency that spoke of long practice. They flanked the mogul, their hands resting gently but immovably on his arms. The man's blustering protests died in his throat, replaced by a sudden, stark terror as he was escorted away, vanishing through the revolving doors as if he had been a mere apparition. The silence that followed was heavier, more charged than before. It was a silence owned by Declan Lynch. The onlookers quickly averted their gazes, suddenly fascinated by their shoes, their phones, the ornate patterns in the marble floor. Ava remained frozen, the pressure on her wrist gone, but a phantom ache remaining. Her mind struggled to process the sequence of events, the humiliation, the sudden intervention, the silent, terrifying removal of her tormentor. The mogul's angry shouts were a distant memory, but this new quiet felt infinitely more dangerous. She was no longer the center of a public shaming, but the focus of a single, powerful man's unnerving attention. Then he began to move toward her. The sound of his polished leather shoes on the marble floor was the only sound in the vast lobby, each step a deliberate, measured beat in the suffocating silence. He did not hurry. His pace was that of a man who has never had to rush for anything in his life, a man for whom the world waits. With every step he took, the cavernous space seemed to contract, the gilded ceiling and onyx walls closing in until there was nothing left but the two of them, suspended in a bubble of tense, unspoken energy. Ava's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird, as the source of that oppressive quiet drew nearer. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she could smell the faint, clean scent of expensive wool and cold night air. His height cast a shadow over her, yet he did not loom in a physically threatening way. His threat was more fundamental, more absolute. And then he did something that completely disarmed her. His gaze did not fall to her body, her face, or the red mark on her wrist. Instead, he looked directly into her eyes, and his expression held no pity, no anger, and no desire. It held something far more unsettling: recognition. He was looking past her fear, past the interpreter's mask, and seeing the core of her, the small, unyielding flame of dignity she protected so fiercely. In her unbroken stare, in the absence of tears, in the rigid set of her jaw that refused to plead or crumble, Declan saw a reflection of something he thought had been extinguished in the world, and certainly within himself. He saw a purity of principle, an unshakable moral compass that had not been bought, bent, or broken by the ugliness of the world. Her silent defiance was a language he understood better than any spoken word, a ghost of a code he had once lived by before his empire was built on its ashes. For a fleeting, imperceptible moment, the ice in his eyes thawed, revealing a flicker of a long-buried wound, a profound and ancient loss. For Ava, his gaze was the most invasive thing she had ever experienced. It was more violating than the mogul's grip, more exposing than the stares of the crowd. She felt seen, truly and completely, by a man who was a creature of shadow. She expected to see coldness, and she did, but it was layered over something else, a deep, resonant sorrow, a chilling clarity that seemed to understand her own solitary existence. She could feel the immense, controlled violence simmering beneath his calm exterior, but what terrified her more was the flicker of shared humanity she saw in the depths of his eyes. It was a connection she didn't want, a truth she couldn't afford to acknowledge. He finally broke the intense silence, though he did not speak to her. Turning his head slightly toward a man who had materialized at his side, his aide, Declan's expression reverted to its impassive mask. His voice, when it came, was low, devoid of inflection, carrying the quiet finality of a judge passing sentence. It was a sound that cut through the air and embedded itself directly into her soul, a command that was both her damnation and her deliverance from the life she knew. It was an act of acquisition, as simple and irreversible as signing a contract. He spoke two words that sealed her fate, erasing her past and defining her future in a single chilling breath. Bring her. The order hung in the air long after he had turned and walked away, his footsteps receding with the same measured, unhurried pace. He did not look back. Ava was left standing in the center of the now empty lobby, the echo of his voice a far more permanent prison than the mogul's grasp had ever been. She had not been saved. She had been claimed. The gilded cage of the hotel had just been replaced by another, one whose bars were forged not of gold, but of a powerful man's silent, unyielding will. The quiet of his world was about to descend, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that it would be the loudest thing she had ever heard. Her new life began in silence, in a penthouse suite that felt more like a beautifully appointed prison than a refuge. The city lights glittered below like a carpet of fallen stars, a universe away from the life she knew. Declan Lynch did not loom or threaten. He simply existed in the space with her, a figure of absolute stillness by the vast window. He offered her a glass of whiskey from a crystal decanter, his movements economical and precise. She refused with a slight shake of her head, her first act of defiance in his world. He accepted it with an almost imperceptible nod, his gaze never leaving her face. He was not studying her fear, but the architecture of her courage, the unyielding lines of her silent opposition. He finally spoke, his voice a low counterpoint to the distant city hum. He explained that the mogul was no longer a concern, that his business in the city had been permanently concluded. It was not a boast, but a statement of fact. Then he laid out the terms of her new reality with chilling clarity. She would continue her work, but exclusively for him. He called it an arrangement for her protection, a necessity in a world that had now taken notice of her. The words were a silken trap, framing her captivity as a form of sanctuary. She had been shielded from one predator, only to be delivered into the hands of another, far more powerful one. Ava felt a cold dread settle deep in her bones, but she refused to let it show. Her survival had always depended on a carefully maintained mask of neutrality, and she would not let it slip now. She did not thank him for his protection, nor did she plead for her freedom. Instead, she met his gaze, her own eyes clear and steady, and asked a simple, direct question that hung in the air like a challenge. "When can I go home?" The query, devoid of panic or deference, seemed to surprise him. A flicker of something, not amusement, but a kind of grudging respect, crossed his features before vanishing back into his impassive mask. He was not accustomed to being questioned, only obeyed. For 3 days, she was left alone. She returned to her small apartment, trying to slip back into the familiar rhythms of her solitary life. But the quiet was different now. It was no longer a comfort but a void filled with his presence. A discreet black sedan was always parked across the street, its occupants invisible behind tinted glass. The city itself felt altered, as if she were viewing it through a new, darker lens. Then the call came from Davies, her boss. His voice was laced with an uncharacteristic mix of awe and terror. A new contract had been drawn up, an exclusive retainer. The client was anonymous. The terms were non-negotiable, and the payment was astronomical. She knew without needing to ask who had sent it. Her first assignment was not in a boardroom, but at a private dinner in a restaurant so discreet it was marked only by a single, unlit lantern. She was seated beside Declan as he met with two older, stone-faced men. The air was thick with unspoken history and veiled threats, a chess match where the pieces were fortunes and lives. Ava translated the few Italian phrases they used, but she quickly understood her purpose. There was not linguistic. The men spoke perfect English. She was a prop, a symbol. Her presence, that of an ordinary, morally upright woman, was a deliberate and unsettling statement in this den of shadows, and she did not yet understand the message he was sending. As the weeks bled into one another, she was drawn deeper into his orbit. She translated documents in the back of his armored car as it sliced through the city, sat silently in meetings where millions were moved with a single nod, and stood by his side at opulent charity galas, where he moved like a phantom among the city's elite. She was a ghost in his world, just as she had been in her old one. But this time, the silence was heavier, the stakes infinitely higher. She saw the mechanics of his empire up close, the cold logic, the quiet intimidation, the absolute loyalty he commanded. It was terrifying, but it was also a masterclass in control, and she could not look away. One evening, in his cavernous office overlooking the sleeping city, she saw a crack in his facade. He was staring at a small silver-framed photograph on his desk, his back to her. His shoulders, usually so straight and unyielding, seemed to carry an immense weight. She saw a flash of profound, unguarded grief on his face in the reflection of the window before he sensed her presence and composed himself, placing the photo face down. For the first time, she saw not the formidable crime boss, but a man haunted by a ghost of his own. The glimpse of his humanity was more disorienting than any display of power. He began to break the professional silence between them with small, carefully chosen questions. He asked about the novel she was reading while waiting for a meeting to begin, its spine creased from use. He inquired about her family, not in an invasive way, but with a quiet, almost clinical curiosity. He once noticed her looking at a painting in his gallery and simply said, "It was my mother's," his voice holding a rare note of softness. These moments were like stones dropped into a deep well, the ripples spreading through the tense quiet that defined their interactions, revealing depth she never expected to find. Ava found herself answering, her replies clipped and cautious at first, then slowly, reluctantly, more open. She spoke of her father's failed business, not as a complaint, but as a simple statement of her history. She described the architectural sketches she drew in her rare moments of solitude. A fragile, dangerous bridge of words began to form between their two disparate worlds. She was terrified of the connection, of the empathy she was beginning to feel for this man who represented everything she stood against. Yet, the echo of his solitude resonated with her own, a shared loneliness that was both a comfort and a warning. Her internal world became a battlefield. The primal fear of him, of his capacity for violence, was a constant, cold presence, but it was now entangled with a growing, unwilling fascination. She saw the way his men looked at him, not just with fear, but with a fierce, unwavering loyalty. She saw the subtle acts of honor within his ruthless code, the way he protected the weak who fell under his purview. She was living in a paradox, repulsed by the darkness of his world but increasingly drawn to the complex, wounded man who commanded it, a man who treated her with more respect than any of her legitimate clients ever had. Declan, in turn, found his legendary control fraying at the edges. Ava was an anomaly in his world of absolutes. Her quiet dignity was not a performance. It was the core of her being, and it acted as a mirror, reflecting the man he might have been. He found himself orchestrating reasons to require her presence, manufacturing needs for her translation skills. He was drawn to her light, not with the desire to possess or extinguish it, but with a desperate, unfamiliar yearning to simply be near it, protecting. Her became a singular focus, a penance for past sins and a shield against his own encroaching darkness. The unspoken tension between them became a physical presence, a third entity in every room they shared. In the close confines of an elevator, she could feel the heat radiating from his body, was acutely aware of the subtle scent of bergamot and cold steel that clung to him. She learned the cadence of his breathing, the way his jaw would tighten when he was deep in thought. He never touched her, yet she felt as if he were constantly touching her, his intense, observant gaze, a tangible force that traced the lines of her face and delved deep into her soul, leaving her feeling completely exposed. The moment it shifted happened in an instant. They were leaving a private auction through a service corridor when a stack of heavy crates carelessly placed began to topple. Before she could react, Declan moved with a speed that was startling. He pulled her against him, his arm wrapping firmly around her waist, shielding her body with his own as the crates crashed to the ground just inches away. The impact sent a cloud of dust into the air, but all she was aware of was the solid wall of his chest and the strong, steady beat of his heart against her ear. For a long, suspended moment, he did not let her go. In the dusty, dimly lit corridor, the world outside ceased to exist. She tilted her head back to look at him, her breath catching in her throat. His gaze was fixed on her, and the cold, controlled mask was gone. In its place was a raw, searing intensity, a tempest of emotions she could not name, possessiveness, fear, a profound and aching vulnerability. It was the look of a man on the edge of a precipice, and it terrified her more than the falling crates ever could. His men appeared, their voices breaking the spell. Declan released her abruptly, his arm falling away, though the phantom pressure of his hold remained. He turned away, his composure snapping back into place as he issued sharp, low commands. But the barrier between them had been irrevocably breached. The silence that fell as they walked to the car was no longer one of distance, but of shared, dangerous intimacy. The accidental touch had become a silent confession, a secret that now pulsed in the air between them, unspoken and undeniable. The first direct threat was not loud or violent. It was silent and deeply personal. A single, flawlessly white gardenia was left on the doorstep of her apartment, a place no one in his world should know. There was no note, no card, but its meaning was terrifyingly clear. It was a flower he had once mentioned his mother grew. It was a message from a rival, a sophisticated and cruel violation of her sanctuary. It told her she was no longer just an observer in his world. She was now a target, a pawn in a game she did not understand. When she told him, her voice trembling for the first time in his presence, the change in him was terrifying. The air in his office grew cold enough to crystallize. His face became a mask of stone, but his eyes, when they met hers, burned with a silent, arctic fury that was more frightening than any shout. He did not speak of revenge. He simply looked at her, his gaze a vow of absolute, brutal retribution against whoever had dared to touch his world through her. In that moment, she understood. His protection was no longer a gilded cage. It was a fortress, and its walls were about to be tested by the full darkness of his world. If you have felt the weight of their silence and the spark of their connection, please like this video, share it with someone who loves a story that grips the heart, and tell us in the comments what you think will happen next. Your engagement helps bring more stories like this to life. The meeting took place in the blood-red heart of a private dining room, a place so exclusive it felt sealed off from the world. Across the polished mahogany table sat Alessandro Moretti, a rival whose smile was as sharp and predatory as broken glass. He was Declan's opposite, ostentatious, loud, dripping with a charm that felt oily and insincere. His gaze kept sliding to Ava, lingering with a proprietary insolence that made her skin crawl. He was not there to negotiate, he was there to perform, to demonstrate that he had found the chink in Declan Lynch's legendary armor. She was the chink, and the knowledge was a cold stone in her stomach. Moretti spoke in theatrical Italian, ignoring Declan and addressing Ava directly, his words a venomous caress. He called her Declan's little songbird, his moral compass, and asked if she enjoyed cleaning the blood from his money. Each phrase was a calculated strike, designed to humiliate Declan by degrading her. Declan remained perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask of granite, but Ava could feel the rage coiling in him, a palpable freezing pressure that lowered the temperature of the room. She was the battlefield, and Moretti was marching his armies across her soul, burning everything in his path to get to the king on the other side. Fear was a familiar companion, but something new rose to meet it, a white-hot, protective fury. She was not his property, not his weakness, and she would not be the tool of his enemy. She had spent a lifetime translating the words of powerful men, remaining a silent, invisible conduit for their ambitions and their rage. Her silence was her shield, her code, the very foundation of her professional survival. To speak for herself in this world was not just a breach of protocol, it was an act of suicide. But watching Moretti use her to wound the one man who, in his own dark way, had shown her a strange and profound respect, felt like an intolerable violation. The transgression came not as a shout, but as a quiet, lethal cut. As Moretti paused for a sip of wine, his eyes glittering with malicious triumph, Ava leaned forward slightly. She did not look at Declan. She fixed her, gazed directly on Moretti, and in flawless ice-cold Italian, her voice devoid of any tremor, she spoke. "A man who must use a woman as a weapon," she said, "has already admitted he has no power of his own." The words fell into the charged silence like shards of glass. It was not an interpretation. It was a judgment. It was her voice, her thoughts, her defiance, offered up in a room where she was meant to have none. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Moretti's smile froze, then shattered. The air crackled, suddenly electric. For a split second, even Declan's composure was broken. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly as he stared at her, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. He had brought her into his world to be a silent observer, a symbol, but she had just become a player. Moretti's amusement curdled into raw fury. He rose from his chair, his hand moving as if to strike her, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage. "You will learn your place," he hissed, the threat a naked promise of violence. Declan moved. It was not the explosive action of a brawler, but the fluid, terrifying economy of a predator. Before Moretti's hand could complete its arc, before anyone could even register his intent, Declan was on his feet and around the table. He did not raise his voice, he did not throw a punch. He simply caught Moretti's wrist in a grip that made the larger man gasp, the sound of bone grinding against bone echoing in the silent room. With a single, controlled movement, Declan twisted, forcing Moretti to his knees. The act was swift, brutal, and utterly personal. It was not business. It was a verdict delivered on behalf of his own shattered code. He leaned down, his voice a low, chilling whisper, meant only for Moretti. But Ava heard every word. "You will not look at her. You will not speak her name. You will not think of her. If you do, the next thing you feel will be the last thing you feel." It was a promise of erasure. Then he released him. Moretti scrambled backward, cradling his wrist, his face a mask of shock, pain, and abject terror. Declan's men, who had been standing like statues, finally moved, flanking the fallen rival and escorting him from the room without a word. The door closed, and the silence that descended was absolute. Declan did not spare a glance for the empty space Moretti had occupied. He turned, his entire universe contracting to the single point of Ava's existence. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, his eyes, stripped of their icy control, burning with a raw, unguarded fire. He reached for her, his hands framing her face with a desperate, trembling urgency that belied the violence he had just committed. His touch was not possessive, but reverent, as if he were holding something infinitely fragile and sacred. He was looking at her as if seeing her for the first time, and in his gaze she saw the terrifying, beautiful truth. His thumb brushed against her cheek, a ghost of a touch that sent a tremor through her entire body. There were no words, only the frantic, silent communication of their locked gazes. In that touch, he was not a crime boss, and she was not his interpreter. They were 2 solitary souls who had just witnessed the other's deepest truth. He had revealed the ferocious, protective heart beneath the ice, and she had shown him the unshakable steel beneath her quiet dignity. He had broken the cardinal rule of his world for her, exposing his soul to his enemies, and she, in defending him, had irrevocably bound her fate to his. They stood there for an eternity, suspended in the silent aftermath. The world had been remade in a single violent and tender act. The gilded cage had dissolved, replaced by a bond forged in transgression, a connection so profound it was both a sanctuary and a death sentence. Nothing else mattered, not the danger, not the consequences, not the two broken worlds they represented. All that existed was the weight of his hands on her skin and the shared, terrifying knowledge that neither of them could ever go back. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the deafening sound of a new beginning. The drive back to the city was a descent into a new kind of silence. It was not the charged, intimate quiet of before, but a cold, hard vacuum, the sound of a steel door swinging shut between them. Declan did not look at her. He stared out at the rain-slicked streets, his profile carved from granite, the muscle in his jaw a tight knot of controlled fury. He was no longer the man who had held her face with trembling hands. He was once again the formidable ruler of a dark kingdom, and she had seen the price of his crown. He didn't take her to her small, familiar apartment. Instead, the car pulled up to a discreet, impossibly luxurious hotel, where she was escorted to a suite, his aide leaving the keycard in her hand with a respectful but final nod. He was already gone. Alone, Ava stood in the center of the vast, impersonal suite. The space was a masterpiece of muted colors and cold surfaces, marble, glass, and polished chrome. It was beautiful, sterile, and utterly devoid of life. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city was a glittering, rain-blurred tapestry, a world she could see but no longer touch. The adrenaline from the confrontation had evaporated, leaving behind a profound and hollow ache. The phantom sensation of his thumb brushing her cheek was a searing memory, a single point of warmth in the encroaching cold. She understood with a chilling certainty that this gilded cage was not a home. It was a holding cell, a place to keep her safe while he went to war, a war she had inadvertently started. Declan returned to the shadows of his penthouse office, the city lights below reflecting off the polished surfaces like cold, distant stars. The confrontation with Moretti was more than an insult. It was a declaration. By showing his hand, by revealing a vulnerability, Declan had painted a target on his own back, and more dangerously on hers. Every action now had to be a calculated move on a chessboard soaked in blood. Protecting her required a level of ruthlessness and distance that felt like a physical amputation. He had to cut her out of his life completely to keep her alive. He picked up the silver-framed photograph from his desk, the one she had seen him looking at before. The woman in the photo had paid the ultimate price for his world. He would not let that happen again. The days bled into one another, measured not by the sun but by the meals that appeared silently outside her door. She had no contact with the outside world. The television remained off, the phone silent. She was a ghost in a luxury tomb, suspended in a timeless, soundless limbo. The silence was a physical weight, pressing in on her, filled with the echo of his whispered threat to Moretti and the memory of his raw, unguarded gaze. She tried to lose herself in her sketchbook, to design the clean, hopeful lines of the buildings she once dreamed of, but her hands felt clumsy, her imagination barren. How could she dream of creating spaces of light when she was so intimately acquainted with the architecture of darkness? A week into her isolation, a slim leather briefcase was delivered by his aide. Inside, nestled in velvet lining, was a new life, a passport with her face but a different name, bank documents detailing an account with a balance that made her dizzy, and a one-way, first-class ticket to Florence, Italy, for a flight departing the next evening. There was no letter, no explanation, just a collection of meticulously arranged items that spelled out a cold, clear message: disappear. He was giving her a fortune, an escape, a future. It was the most generous and the cruelest thing anyone had ever done to her. It was his final act of protection, and it felt like an execution of the bond they had forged. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the ticket cool against her trembling fingers. The full weight of his decision crashed down on her. He wasn't just sending her away for her safety, he was erasing her. He was scrubbing the variable from his equation, cauterizing the wound she represented. The brief, intense connection that had burned so brightly between them was a fire he had to extinguish before it consumed his entire world. The rain began to fall again, lashing against the windows in a furious, relentless rhythm. She felt a kinship with the storm, a reflection of the tempest inside her own heart. He had shown her a glimpse of his soul, only to prove that it was a place she could never be allowed to dwell. Her mind drifted back to her father, to the quiet injustice that had shaped her entire existence. She had built a fortress around her morality, a rigid code that defined right and wrong in absolute terms. Yet, for Declan, she had not only breached her own walls, but had stood upon them and fought. She had defended a man whose hands were stained with a yai. Darkness she couldn't comprehend, and she had done it without hesitation. The realization left her feeling profoundly unmoored. If her moral compass could be so easily swayed by a shared glance, a protective touch, what did that say about the woman she had become? The conflict was a quiet, tearing agony within her. In the crushing solitude, a new clarity began to emerge from the wreckage of her emotions. The pain did not lessen, but it sharpened into a kind of grim understanding. Declan was a king in a kingdom of predators. In his world, love was not a strength but a weapon to be used against you. Vulnerability was a death sentence. By sending her away, he wasn't just protecting her from his enemies, he was protecting her from himself, from the part of him that would sacrifice everything to keep her safe. His cold, clinical severance was, in its own brutal way, the most profound act of love a man like him was capable of. It was a sacrifice made in the only language he knew: silence, distance and erasure. She walked to the vast window and pressed her palm against the cool glass, looking down at the river of headlights flowing through the city's arteries. The ticket in her other hand was no longer a sentence, but a question. He had opened the door to her cage, offering her a gilded escape into a life of quiet anonymity. She could run, disappear into the Tuscan hills, and spend the rest of her days trying to forget the color of his eyes. But running felt like a different kind of imprisonment, a life spent looking over her shoulder. He had shown her what it was to have a voice, to fight for something, even if it was in the heart of a storm. She would not let that lesson be in vain. Her decision settled not with a crash, but with a quiet, unshakable calm. She would leave this room, but she would not take his flight. She would not accept his blood money, or the false identity he had created for her. She would walk out into the rain and build her own life. A life forged, not from his protection or her past, but from the resilient, defiant woman she had discovered herself to be. The silence between them would remain, a permanent, echoing chasm. But it would no longer be her prison. It was simply the space that separated his world from the one she was now strong enough to build for herself. His name would become a scar, but she would no longer be the wound. 5 years passed, each one a deliberate brick laid in the foundation of a new life. Ava Thorne was no longer a ghost in the corridors of power. She was an architect of them. Her firm, small but fiercely independent, occupied a sun-drenched loft in a revitalized part of the city, a space defined by clean lines, exposed brick, and the scent of blueprint paper and fresh coffee. She had built a world of light and substance, a direct and silent rebuttal to the opulent shadows she had once inhabited. She moved with a quiet confidence now, her gaze no longer downcast, but fixed on the horizons she was sketching into existence. The past was a locked room, the key long since discarded, yet sometimes in the deepest quiet of the night she could still feel the phantom pressure of a hand on her face. She was on the verge of her most significant project, a public library in the underserved neighborhood where she had grown up. It was more than a commission, it was a tribute to the man her father had been, a chance to build something that would stand for community and knowledge, a fortress against the kind of quiet injustices that had crushed him. But her vision was threatened by a monolithic corporate competitor, a firm known for swallowing smaller rivals through political leverage and financial brute force. They were everything she despised, a concrete and steel embodiment of the soulless power she had escaped. The fight was becoming ugly, with permits mysteriously stalled and city officials suddenly unavailable, the invisible machinery of influence grinding against her modest dream. One rainy Tuesday, the final blow seemed to fall. Her primary investor, citing unforeseen market pressures, withdrew his funding. The news was delivered with a cold corporate apology that did nothing to soften the reality. She was ruined. The project was dead. That evening she sat alone in her office, the city lights blurring through the rain-streaked windows, the weight of her father's history settling upon her like a shroud. The familiar despair tasted of ash. She had fought so hard to build a life on her own terms, only to find that the game was just as rigged on this side of the wall. The powerful still wrote the rules, and the honest still paid the price. The silence of her defeat was absolute, a hollow echo of a past she could never truly outrun. The next morning everything changed. An anonymous source had leaked a trove of documents to the city's leading investigative journalist, exposing a massive bribery scandal involving her competitor and several city officials. By noon, the story was a firestorm. By 3 o'clock, her rival firm had withdrawn its bid amid a flurry of public denials and impending indictments. By 5, a wire transfer appeared in her firm's account from an untraceable European trust for an amount that was precisely double what she had lost. There was no explanation, no contact, just the cold, irrefutable fact of a board swept clean by an invisible, brutally efficient hand. A chilling sense of recognition washed over her, the feeling of a phantom predator moving through the darkness on her behalf. She worked late into the night, her mind a maelstrom of shock, disbelief, and a terrifying, unwelcome gratitude. As she stood over her drafting table, finalizing the plans that were suddenly, miraculously alive again, she noticed it. Placed carefully on the corner of the blueprint where there had been nothing before was a single, flawless, white gardenia. Its petals were like cool porcelain, its scent filling the quiet air with a fragrance that was both funereal and achingly beautiful. It was not a threat. It was a message, an acknowledgement, a ghost of a touch across an unbridgeable chasm. He was still out there, a king in his dark kingdom, watching from the shadows, and for one night, using his immense power not to conquer but to shield. She picked up the flower, its stem cool against her fingers. There were no tears, only a profound, heartbreaking clarity. He had not saved her. He had cleared her path. It was his only way of honoring the woman she had become, an act of redemption performed in the silent language they had always shared. She looked out at the skyline, a tapestry of light and shadow she would now help to shape. They would never meet again, would never speak another word, but this single silent gesture was a final, indelible translation of a debt that could never be named. They were two separate souls, forged in the same fire, who had found their own ways to build something that would last. If the silent bond between these two souls has left an imprint on yours, show your support by liking and sharing this story. Let their journey resonate with others. Subscribe for more tales that explore the light hidden in the deepest shadows, and tell us in the comments below, what do you believe is the most powerful form of redemption?